I'm Eric Lorber. I'm the director of Rain Taxi, and I want to welcome you to our 20th Twin Cities Book Festival. This is the last of 19 live events we've presented over the past 3 days, and while we sorely miss seeing you in person, and we especially miss being able to give out copies of our quarterly book review, we have been delighted to do this online and to experience and spread the word with so many people both in and out of Minnesota. We want to encourage you to stay in touch with us. Consider getting a copy of the magazine at your local independent bookstore, or become a member and get it in your mailbox. We like to think it's like having a book festival in your mailbox every 3 months. If you've missed any of the other live events and you want to see them, don't forget you can watch the replays and experience them that way. Many of them, as this one does, have ASL interpretations, and we want to thank the University of Minnesota Libraries for supporting that. Also on the festival website, you'll find a handful of pre-recorded presentations in our Minnesota Writers Mashup and the chapbook launch for our latest publication, which presents 9 Black poets of the Twin Cities responding to the murder of George Floyd and other events this past summer. We also have online an exciting exhibit hall filled with scores of publishers, organizations, and authors who want to share their literary passions with you. And I'm excited to tell you that the festival website will remain up throughout the rest of the year, so you can come back anytime and continue to explore. There's so much to see. For now, let me say that I'm thrilled to conclude this event with author Ayad Akhtar. We began our author presentations 3 days ago with a message of hope from poet Naomi Shihab Nye. We wanted to conclude with an urgent call to action, and that is what the book Homeland Elegies feels like to me. Ayad Akhtar is known to theater fans as the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Disgraced and other works of drama. Fiction readers may remember his exceptional debut novel American Dervish, a nuanced depiction of the struggles of a Muslim family set here in the Midwest. And those who cherish the principle of free expression cheered to learn recently that he will assume the presidency of the important organization PEN America this December. To speak with such an author, I called on another artist who works in multiple modes and has made taking an unflinching look at troubling truths an essential part of her art, the musician and writer Dessa. Rain Taxi proudly published Dessa's poetry chapbook, A Pound of Steam, a few years back. You can find it on our website. And we can't recommend highly enough her amazing nonfiction work, My Own Devices. I want to remind all our viewers that you can buy books by the authors at the link below. You can ask questions. I know they'll be delighted to get your questions and incorporate them into the discussion tonight. And if you enjoy this session or anything else that we've offered on the festival website, please consider making a donation. We're a nonprofit organization. We love bringing this free festival to Minnesota and now the world every year. And every dollar we receive goes into making the next one possible. For now, I'm really delighted to present this concluding event of our 20th Twin Cities Book Festival. And I'd normally invite you to be welcoming the authors to the stage. If you want to applaud at home, please do. It'll make you feel good. Here's Ayad Akhtar and Dessa.
Thank you so much, Eric. Very generous introductions all around.
Thank you. Hi, Dessa.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh my gosh, thank you for making the time.
I'm so stoked. Man, I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I'm diving in.
Good. Me too.
Yeah. So Homeland Elegies, anyone? It's metafiction. So in it, you have a protagonist who bears your own name and is also a writer. And there's something that he says, a phrase that he often uses in instruction. He says, the longer the middle, the better the story. Can you Can you expand on that? What does that mean?
Sure. So I've been trying to learn how to tell a good story for a really long time. And I wouldn't say that I've figured it out, but I think I've learned a few things from folks who do it well. And one of the things that I've learned, I think, is that the quicker, I think Paul Schrader, the great screenwriter, wrote Taxi Driver, once said, the way I write a scene is like going to a party. You show up late and you leave early, right? And in a way, that's kind of a template for this idea that get through the beginning as quickly as you can, and once you get to the ending, just deal with your stuff and leave them wanting more. That the real body of the story is the middle of the story, and I like to think, if we were to speak from a craft point of view, technically, that the middle of a story begins when we know what a character wants. When it's very clear to us what the main character or a series of main characters really wants, the middle has begun. And the middle ends when we discover whether or not they get, or that person gets, what he or she or they want, or don't, or what the disappointments are. As Oscar Wilde says, the only thing worse in life than not getting what you want is getting what you want, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the key. That's the central story. So, I think in the book there's a metaphor that I use that my father in the book uses of watching a match. Right, watching whether it's a football game or a baseball game or something, and when you don't know what the outcome is, that's the moment of highest engagement, the greatest intensity of sort of involvement. Mm-hmm. And when the outcome is clear, then you kind of lose interest. So it's the same with a story. When you don't know what's going to happen, when you don't know whether that desire is going to get resolved, you're still in the middle, and the middle is the area of greatest narrative intensity.
So in your own book, I mean, you talk about the beginning being kind of the establishment of the big objective. Like, can you kind of sketch out just enough of the scaffolding of the story? You know what I mean? So that those who haven't had the chance to read it yet can come along for the ride with us.
Sure. Yeah. That's an interesting question. Wow. I talk so much about story structure in the book, but in a way, I break up narrative structure in this book so much that I kind of work at cross purposes to some of the things that the book suggests, right? So I'm constantly critiquing the structure, but using the things that I'm critiquing. And so if I had to sort of outline what I guess the book really is about, it's about my parents' generation and my generation so my parents' generation of immigrants mm-hmm. and their kids, really me, and what our lives and what their lives were when they came to America, what America became in the 50 years that they were here, that we've all been here, and what that says about what America has become, if you will. And so there are portraits of a lot of different people, most notably my parents in the book, but also some American-born kids of immigrants of that generation, not just myself, a woman I get involved with named Asha. And
you are wearing out these air quotes.
I gotta keep reminding people that it's a novel. I mean, I tell you, I did one interview, just every single question, it's a radio interview, every single question was, so did this happen? So did that happen?
Yeah.
Did that happen? Did that happen? Did that happen? It's like, it's called a novel. I mean, so some things happened, but I changed a lot of stuff. But anyway, yeah.
You mentioned having these kind of characters that, you do have like a lot of almost vignettes, right? So these people who come into the story to have really sometimes like perspectives on fundamental Americanness that may differ or coincide with our protagonists. Yeah. But these people that kind of come through, offer their hot take, stay for a while, become enmeshed or move on. Yeah. Like, the amount of exposition that you have to do for the readers, like me, and to be honest, for American readers, to really understand the nuances of the interpersonal connections.
Sure.
Like, I think halfway through the book, I was like, I just imagine like a field of Post-it notes, because there's so much that an American reader might not know that's really important to the story. So like, talking about some of the nuances of the conflict between Pakistan and Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, and also between generations here. I mean, how do you handle that before you write the book? Do you have like a list of here's all the stuff that I have to go through?
Wow. This book is, it's 25 years of kindling. I mean, I've been accumulating all of this material for so long, and so many of these stories abandoned, the story of Riaz and the mosques and all of that sort of stuff. That's an idea I had when I was in grad school, and I didn't write it then, or I tried to, and it didn't work. And then I sort of finally found a way to work it into this book. It just kind of, but there was a technique to keep a lot of the disparate pieces, if not alive, keeping them at least, juggling, keeping them in the air, if you will, right?
Uh-huh.
I remember reading about Nabokov writing his last couple of novels, that he had this technique where he was writing sentences on note cards. So he'd write a sentence on a note card and he'd put it in a shoebox, and he'd write another sentence on a note card, put it in a shoe. And over time would have these shoeboxes filled with sentences, and then would go through and rearrange them and arrange them. So I've been using note cards in a different way my whole career as a screenwriter. I put scenes on note cards. So I took note cards, and what I did was I put an idea or a detail or a fragment of dialogue or a nuance that, so for example, that you're talking about, two characters talking about a particular thing. I would just note, Afghani history, 1992, whatever it would be. And I had a huge stack of note cards. And so for sections of the book that felt like there were appropriate for this or that, I would kind of lay them out. And for the final chapter, which is about 100 pages about my father and his court case, which was based substantially on a real malpractice lawsuit, it was all up on the wall. I had all those note cards on the wall so that I could work through them systematically.
If you feel like I'm beating a dead horse, stop me. But
no, it's okay. It's good.
Part of me thinks, okay, whenever you're doing a big novel, you're going to have note card. You're going to have some sort of structure to help you keep all of the information at play and understand how it relates to one another. But you have this special job, and also just having to inform a lot of your readers, not only of like she has a crush on him and they're salty because of some jealousy from when they were kids, but also like, hey, in 1947, that's like when partition happened. But, so how do you get all of that historical data that a reader has to understand without it sounding like vegetables? Right.
Wow. I don't know. I mean, I think by telling a great story, I think, by promising, for example, with partition, I say, I start that section out by saying that, in the 1960s, if you were in Lahore, Pakistan, you would have imagined you were in some golden age, right? You would never have thought that only 15 years earlier, people were pulling dead, bloody bodies from trains, and there were arms and legs along the route sort of poking out through the dirt from dead bodies. And so you kind of summon the detail and summon the vivid recollections, and then inside of all of that, you just get the information out that we're talking about partition, and that once India and Pakistan were one country, and then they were severed into two, and some people think it's the British that are to blame. And by the way, my dad always felt like that was a lame excuse to blame the British. So you're constantly moving off exposition into dramatic action. But then you anytime you have an opportunity, just fold right back into another piece of exposition. I think the big secret for me, and on a craft level, was when I could crack the idea that as soon as an audience starts to feel that an expectation you've set up for them is being met, you're already behind the audience. So in the process of setting up an expectation, so when I teach, there's a math equation I use. It's called A, B, A, C. So you have A, you introduce A, and then you go to B, and then you go back to A, and then the audience thinks you're going to go to B, but then you go to C. So before you've set up a pattern, as soon as the audience begins to feel there's a pattern, you already break the pattern. And so the book is constantly, on a prose level, is constantly doing that. So you always have this feeling like, oh, wait, that was unexpected. Oh, that's unexpected. Oh, I didn't expect that. Oh, I didn't expect that. There's a science to that, which is really just, it's neurochemistry.
Well, it's interesting because I wonder, as you're a practitioner of that science on the page and on the stage, it seems like there's one really important variable a baton that's sort of uncomfortably passed, and that's like the temporal aspect. So it's like you get to decide how long your play lasts.
Yeah.
Right? It's an hour and 45 minutes. And as a reader, I have much more control over how long my experience of reading your book lasts. I get the temporal. Right. So in figuring out
that's why I broke it up so much. Because
and for readers who
I know the audience's expectation right now, the readers don't have the same, we're trained by these devices increasingly to have less and less concentration and less interest in sustained reading experience. So I'm constantly breaking up this larger thing into much smaller chunks that whether it's the description of wine that goes on for a page and a half, and then you can stop and you can come back and you can then you come back. It's almost like I compare it to a social media scroll, that there are all of these things that are coexisting, and the platform or the narrative, the larger story, which is the story of America and also this character named Akhtar in America, holds all of these disparate pieces, whether it's exposition or whether it's descriptions of 1959 Chateau Margaux, or whether it's disquisitions about debt, or whether it's sex scenes, or whether it's any number of other things, right?
And for people who've read the book already, I mean, I think even just in looking at like the layout on the page, you can see some of that you've got some presentation that's like literally a timeline. You've got some presentation that's in a screenwriting format, right? You can see, as if you were to go and just flip down the pages, you'd see that kind of variation just in the typography.
Right. That's right. That's right.
Your YER, your vocabulary. I gotta say, man, like I'm vain on that point. It's nuts. It's nuts. Yeah.
Though the father in the book keeps telling him, someday you'll learn. Simpler is better.
But my question was: is it exciting when you're writing on the page to be able to like fully flex that muscle because you're not constrained by the expectations of daily speech?
Right.
For characters, like, are you stoked? Like, yes, I get to use all my full spectrum of colors. Whereas when you're writing drama, you've got to make sure to speak as people do casually.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's interesting. So that's a very interesting question from a couple of different perspectives. One is that I'd say one of the central, if the book is a political act, which I think it is, I think that the fundamental act is an attempt to reclaim meaning. That I feel that political speech, daily speech, has increasingly become polluted by a kind of, whether it's ideology or whether it's within the idea of agenda, that we're not hearing language really. There is this erosion of the meaning of language and the richness of the American language, which I think is just such an extraordinary language that I love so much. And the other part of it is that, interestingly enough, the writer who I read the most and who I am inspired by the most is Shakespeare. And of course, when Shakespeare writes for characters, he's got them saying all kinds of crazy stuff. And so I can never do that. You're right. I can't do that in a play set today and make it work. So in a way, I think it probably, this narrator who speaks this book to the reader, he's somebody who actually is he's trying to find a way to tell this story that will allow him to use the language, not only that he has, but that we have, the language we have.
And when you talk about maybe a degradation or a dissolution of the kind of language, particularly
cheapening also, yeah.
Did you say cheapening?
Also a cheapening, yeah, all of it.
You had this line in the book, when people are in pain, they don't always mean what they say. And that was prompted, I think, by a Susan Sontag comment on a word cowardice. Like, how do you
think at that particular juncture, I think I'm remembering Susan Sontag getting pilloried for using the word coward, saying that it's surely we can't describe the 9/11 terrorists as cowards. We could describe them as many things that are not good, but cowards would not be appropriate. And of course, she was pilloried for that. And so when there's this attack in New York City, the governor and the mayor both say, this was a particularly cowardly act. And so the narrator kind of muses, ironically says, well, when people are in pain, they don't always mean what they say. So they're calling them cowards, but they don't really mean it.
Do you think that that's related to the current cheapening of our political discourse? Is just like electrified by pain such that it's more difficult to articulate with precision our experiences and ideas?
Wow, that's a
or not, or am I missing the point?
No, I think it's a wonderful thought. I think that the way that I've thought of it is that entertainment has become the dominant model, not only of politics, but of thought. And that the entertainment value of language, rather than the truth value of language, has the salesmanship of language, the ability of language to sell us, whether it's ideas or products. The advertising industry has become very, very good at sort of getting to our neurochemistry before we even understand what's happening. And the sort of changing of the valences of meanings of words in order to be more useful to particular ends, to particular agendas, usually commerce, but in our era, politics. And so language now seems to be second, it's constantly in service of these various, interests, if you will, whether they're political or economic or industrial. And in a way, we've taken on with the social media and the sort of large, the very widespread dissemination of this kind of stuff because of the internet and all the screens that we're constantly on. It seems to me that we're increasingly in this bubble where language is being used in this way constantly.
Can you give me an example, like, of a particular term that feels hijacked, or does it just feel like our vocabularies have all sort of atrophied, or how do you most perceive it in concrete terms?
I'd have to think about that. I feel like it's something that I am constantly dealing with, but ideologically, the classic example is Lee Atwater. When giving money, big government was a way to start talking about giving money to Black people, right? That was coded language.
Southern strategy.
Right, and so, right, but that the strategy was about using words in a certain way. And so over time, we would start talking about libertarianism, but what we were really talking about was protecting the interests of a certain class. But there were all these coded ways of speaking about this stuff, right? So that's the classic sort of example of what I'm talking about. But it's so much more widespread now, and it's not just political. I think the dominant sort of erosion of language is happening because of advertising and commerce, really. And so so what it leads to a very restricted vocabulary and a very restricted register of our language that I think I would like the book to make a case for reclaiming the richness of the American tongue.
Depending on the context in which it's used, probably a word like access or accessibility is it can also be code for a lot of things.
Sure.
But when you're in reading this novel, I admit, have like a device bedside handy, and in part it was to reference terms or names with which I was unfamiliar, and I'll also say, I think like a lot of other readers, there were quite a few with which I was unfamiliar. Yeah. To what extent do you worry, if at all, like when you're writing, like, my standard reader might not know in this chapter 5 of my references, and I'm comfortable with that threshold because I still got them and they can look it up if they want. 15, okay, am I worried about losing them, or is it just like David Foster Wallace, look it up?
I think there are 2 levels. One is that I need to make sure it's working on a human level for everybody.
Okay.
And that every sentence, however difficult, is clear without a dictionary. It's clear because the context makes it clear, right? And then the second level is for those who are interested or who have literary background or who are interested in history or who are interested in these ideas. There's more there. Like, for example, a really good example of this is there's a chapter that takes place in Scranton called God's Country, in which the narrator gets pulled over and he has this encounter with a state trooper, and then the state trooper sends him to a mechanic who ends up being his uncle, and then he gets ripped off there. And it's a whole sort of like microaggression kind of thing, but it's also a chapter about America as a Christian country. And the 4 the four people's names, the four people who the reader meets through this narrator over the course of this chapter are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? So now a lot of people probably won't get that. I mean, it's not necessarily something that, you know, they're going to be scouring to try to get the references. But of course, in a chapter called God's Country about this Christian America, you know, so there's a lot of that stuff, but I don't think a reader needs to have figured that out in order to appreciate the experience.
Yeah, I follow. You know, in that scene that you talk about where our protagonist is pulled over, there is an exchange between Trooper Matthew, who pulls him over, and our protagonist, where there's a passing that happens where our Pakistani American character passes for a moment as India.
Yeah.
Can you explain, and that happens in several times throughout like your catalog.
Yeah.
Can you explain that dynamic? Why
Sure.
would you pass? Mm-hmm.
So in that moment, the narrator talks about how he will often get asked where his name is from or where he's from, and recognizes that by saying that his parents, he will often say first Wisconsin, but then they'll say, no, well, where are you really from? So then by answering, well, my parents are from, if he says Pakistan, the immediate reference are terror and sort of all kinds of negative things, Islam and all kinds of stuff. But if he says India, then people think, oh, chicken tikka masala, yoga pants, Bollywood, you know, gyrating flash mobs and whatnot, right? Mm. And it turns out that his parents were born in what was then India because they were both born pre-partition. So he comes up with this kind of thing, and it's another character in my body of work who also does this, Amir in Disgraced, who presents himself as Indian to sort of get away from all of this stuff, because there's no upside to being associated with Pakistan. And anyway, in this case, it's just a trooper, and what's the big deal? But it's interesting because there's instances of casual lying that the narrator engages in throughout the book, which, you know, they're by design, and they are intended in a part to make the reader wonder to what extent this narrator can be relied on.
Mm-hmm. And, you know,
even though he has my name and many of the facts of my life.
You know, I think in a lot of American culture, we're really comfortable with the like intellectual division of Judaism. Like, is someone culturally Jewish or is someone a practitioner of the Jewish faith? We're comfortable with that. I don't think we do that same kind of comfortable distinguishing between almost any other religion / cultural heritage.
I think that's very true, what you just said. And
you do this really awesome maneuver in the book on page 110, which is the game I'm going to ask you to read in a second, where you talk about like, hey, let's just kind of turn that hand mirror back on what it means to be the inheritant of a Christian tradition.
Oh, wow. Brilliant. So so there's a section here that I'll read from. So the narrator is basically saying that we Muslims lived in a Christian land. That's how we saw it, at least in the families I knew. We lived in a Christian land, but we didn't understand Christianity. And so then I skip on a little bit later. I say, it might be hard for a non-Muslim American, an agnostic or atheist or a secular humanist to understand the perspective I'm describing, in which a sole signifier, Christian, is used to stand in for the totality of American life. For indeed, where some might see modernity or individualism or mercantile democracy or the heritage of the Enlightenment or an irreducibly complex and endlessly heterogeneous nation, we saw Christianity. To us, it was all Christian, not just the churches and their ice cream socials and Friday fish fries, or the bacon at breakfast, or the wine with wafers on Sundays and with everything else all week long, not just the place names and first names drawn from the Gospels and the roll of Catholic saints, or the painted eggs in April and pine reeds and winter sleds in December. No, I mean also the department store sales in January and the interest charging credit cards used at them, and the vacations spent at the beach driven by the bizarre urge to darken one's skin, and the shrill, perfect fifths of a violin, and the notion that running a piece of toilet paper along your anus is enough to keep you clean, and the discomfort of working with a blade of cloth tied to your neck so tightly you can barely breathe, and the bikinis and knee-high skirts, and of course, the needlessly happy ending to every story. And that goes on and on.
So rad. Also, shout out to Alan on a heroic keep up. Yeah, a lot of the novel talks about America through the lens of like relentless acquisitiveness, just consuming and consumption and money and status. Like, is a word like greed just I don't know, does it just oversimplify America? Tell me, like, why isn't greed enough? I
love that question. I love that question. You're the first person to ever. I've thought about that so much. You know, this idea that somehow, you know, if greed is the word, if that's one of the 7 deadly sins, if it is our deadly sin, our notion of greed is really shallow. Mm-hmm. Because we are almost all completely beholden to this impulse. It's not just the folks on Wall Street. I mean, the entire society is predicated on acquisition. But it's not just that. It's the tools that have been developed to instrumentalize and facilitate that acquisition. And notably in this book, it's really the franchise of debt that I think some characters in the book make the case has transformed American society noticeably for the worse, though many people would say for the better, but the narrator is not convinced that that's the case. I think it is more than greed. Yes.
Can we do it? Explain it to me like I'm 5 on that phrase. The franchise of debt. What are you talking about when you talk about the
Donald Trump is impossible without debt. He does not own what he says he owns. He is not the person who he says he is. He never has been. He's been indebted. I mean, this is not news. The New York Times reports it in, you know, whatever. Everyone says, oh my God, he's got $400 million in debt. Or he's $1 billion. He's been indebted his entire life.
But
so this gap between what somebody has, the perceived value and the actual value, the appearance and the reality, the ability to say, well, I want X, and the reality of what one has or should have or could have given the circumstances of one's life. You know, John Guare, the great American playwright, said to me in his lifetime, the 2 things that fundamentally changed is they stopped the draft and they gave us all credit cards, right? So we stopped having, let's not get into the politics of the draft, but we stopped having to make any kind of mortal sacrifice for the nation. And our individual desires were given the seemingly, at this point, limitless franchise or freedom to continue to flourish and proliferate like a cancer. Whatever we want, we can have. And, you know, we see it at the fundament of our society. Everything is, I'll give you an example. The American universities have taken on $2.5 trillion in debt in the last, train passing, sorry. $2.5 trillion in debt in the last generation and a half. I don't mean students, I mean universities. Universities have taken on that debt to upgrade their facilities, to bring on better faculty so that they can attract students. Those students will pay tuitions that create cash flow. That cash flow is used to take on more debt. This is called the growth model. Every industry operates under the growth model. And so what this means is that over the last generation and a half, tuition has risen, not to keep pace with inflation, but to keep pace with debt payments. Students are paying the debt of the universities that they're going to. So what does that mean? That means that students walk into a classroom and the entire hierarchy of pedagogy has been inverted. They're the ones paying down the debt for the university. So why shouldn't they tell teachers what they want to learn and what is acceptable in a classroom? Customer is king, not just as a concept, but as an economic reality because of the way that the system works.
And you equate that, at least, or I think you suggest a relationship between that kind of understanding of student as consumer, paying a premium price for the product, that that's equated with an academic, God, at best, maybe lack of rigor in some settings, and at worst, like a student-designed syllabi, essentially, that does everything but challenge the.
Yeah, but Dessa, that's the model. We've become citizens to customers to reality. We're not citizens of a republic anymore. Mm. You know, the things that were guaranteed to us, at least under the social contract, the right to education, the right to protection, the right to healthcare, say, in some societies, all of those things you can have if you can pay for them. And the fiction that's offered to us is that the system will ensure that we get the lowest price.
Which is as you explain in a really enlightening section of the book, even when you're going into some of the detail about like how we currently understand trust and antitrust legislation, that really the final and increasingly only metric by which we decide whether or not like big corporate entities are allowed to merge is consumer price, as opposed to any other metric of like human well-being. You know, you talk about this,
or even communal well-being. Or business well-being. What about the community that the 86 cents of every dollar spent in a Walmart leaves that community, and in the process kills the entire local economy? How is that justifiable? Because it gives you the lowest price? Is consumer price the only stakeholding metric that exists within a society? That's the society we're creating. We have created, and then folks wonder why there's so much anger and despair across the heartland of this country.
And you talk about anger. Oh man, there was one question that you asked particularly about anger, and I think you draw like a lot of parallels between essentially like the Muslim community in the U.S. and the Black community in the U.S. and this sort of concern perhaps by both communities about if there were an unchecked expression of anger and of rage, that might look bad essentially in the majority white eyes. And so that's something that some people want to stifle. Right. And in other parts of the book, you say like, nothing gets done without rage. Like that is also a position to consider. Right. I mean, when you talk about this book as a political act, I've heard you say in other interviews, you're not the hope guy. Like you're not Obama, man. You don't do the Shepherd Fairy hope thing. That's not your line. You are a self.
It's not my job. It's not my job. I don't think.
And I'm not going to ask you to. So what if it's not hopeful? Yeah. What is the objective? What is the agenda of the political speech in this book?
We have to get on the same page. If we can't understand what the problems are, we can't resolve them. We can't even begin to go about resolving them. We've allowed a certain ideology, certain economic ideology that has encouraged individualism, whether it's the right to make as much money as you want, or have as many guns as you want, or use whatever bathroom as you want, that individual rights and individual expression of myself is what the society should protect, and that is sacrosanct in the society. But there's no way to define, you can't have a society, a collective society, which is just about protecting everybody's individual rights. There has to be some meaningful collective agreement about what the collective good is, not just my good, but our good. And so what's happened is that the economics of the last 50 years have encouraged rampant, one way of talking about it is privatization, but it's really much deeper than that. It's about encouraging individualism in a way that has changed the incentives of how people move through the world, so that it doesn't even really make sense anymore to ask the question of what is a collective good, or what are we? Screw what we are. What matters is what I am. We're 50 years into that transformation. In order to sort of begin to make sense of how we get to the other side, and I do think climate change is going to change this. We're going to have to stop asking that question. It's going to have to be about us. It's not about what I want anymore. It's about how do we protect and save and preserve what we've got left, because if we don't do that, none of us will have anywhere to go, right?
But it's only backed against the wall at cannon point, right? When it's literally an existential threat that we're learning how to ask that question.
I don't underestimate two things. I don't underestimate the power of a truly transformative figure. We haven't had that.
Huh, I'm surprised to hear you say that.
Well, I mean, but it's possible. It's possible. I mean, Obama unfortunately was not that person. Didn't end up being that person, right? Could have, but the circumstances led to, there's a lot of interesting stories about that, which we could talk about sometime. And the other thing, history is always filled with surprises, as COVID has shown us. And if the kind of economic difficulties I suspect are ahead for our country and for many in our country for the next half generation, that may be enough of an education for enough people in this country to understand that staring at your phone and buying a bunch of shit is really not ultimately what life is about.
That it's not it.
Right. So, but I don't know what's going to break that, because these companies have gotten into our brains. And it's going to take something very significant to break that.
Before we bring, first of all, this is awesome. Before we bring Eric back into the conversation, I am going to ask just a couple of quick questions on craft.
Sure.
Yeah. One of which I'm sourcing now from our online audience watching live. Awesome, guys. Thanks. This one is from Marianne. She says, when you're writing a novel, how much of your technique relies on theater?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't, there's a lot of dialogue in this novel. So I do rely on my sort of ability to understand what plays in dialogue form, because the art of dialogue isn't necessarily just about mimicking the way people speak. It's also about making sure that everything that's said is moving something forward. You're always moving the audience's experience of the characters, of the scene, of the situation, or an understanding forward with every single line. And so that kind of economy and compression is something that I really do bring to all of the dialogue sections in the book.
It seemed like from a bystander's perspective, it seemed also like a really handy way to take care of some of that what might have been otherwise an expository burden. So if you have someone who's uninitiated wander through a scene and go, what? Then we have the opportunity for our protagonist to be like, well, let me tell you a little bit about it. And we get to then benefit from this ignorant person's education.
That's a classic.
Then, sex and violence. I was reading today a little bit of a section from your Pulitzer Prize-winning stage work, Disgraced, where there's a really violent scene and you make note, hey, to make this look real, director, you might want some of this to happen off stage. This should be brutal. Mm-hmm. In this novel, you have quite a few, you have a handful of getting into it sex scenes. Did you already have an approach about how you wanted to tackle those scenes?
Sex scenes are hard to write because you really, again, it's the same thing with dialogue. Everything's got to move in a book or in a scene. Everything has to move the audience's understanding forward. That it can't just be luxuriating in the detail or the experience for its own sake. And with sex, it's tricky because there's a temptation to try to replicate or imitate, if you will, the experience in some way in language. And so there's one scene in particular, sex scene in particular, that takes place in a theater in this book, which really had to reveal the unconscious level of racial rage that the narrator has not really alluded to yet, the depth of it, and doesn't really even know himself until he discovers it, surprisingly, in this scene. And so the revelation of that for the reader, but also for the narrator, is the purpose of that scene. So everything in that scene, every sentence has to build tension in a way to build to that revelation.
Yeah. Last one before bringing Eric in. You mentioned in I think it was an interview magazine, that on rare occasion you will get some feedback from a critic that helps you become a better writer, a better practitioner of craft. So can you share one bit of feedback that it felt like advanced you to a next level? And then also, what has been the compliment that you've most appreciated about this work?
So there's a critic, a couple of critics who really, I don't know, they've been very kind to me in the sense that even when they've criticized me, they've sort of given me their guidance. Like if they've said, the play's great, but I was missing this, and he's going to have another production, and I hope he tries to attend to some of this stuff, right? So those tidbits, if you will, or those encouragements in criticism have always been specific to the work. I haven't gotten a blanket comment from a critic that has made me that I could really repeat out of context. That's sort of, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I do get some of those, but they're usually, this guy's got no talent. So
okay.
Those don't help too much.
Sure.
And the compliment that I've appreciated the most, I've been touched by so many things people have said. I think that some of the stuff around my parents, around the portrayal of these two parents, and particularly of my mother, but also my father, I've been very, very touched. Somebody called me today about one of those scenes and something that, I think the narrator says at one point he's by his mother and she's dying. And he says, I suddenly realized, had I, in wanting something from her that she couldn't give me, hadn't I denied myself so much that she could? Right? And somebody called me today about that, and they were really moved, and I was just very touched by that.
Yeah, it's right around page 216, I think. It's a great line. Yeah, it's a great line. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Dessa, thank you. Thank you to the festival, and thanks to the folks in Minneapolis.
And if I can now, I'll bring Eric back on to wrap us up. Thank you to everyone who's watched as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. I want to echo those thanks and just say, wow. That was exhilarating. I think you two have invented the roller coaster of rides here at the Twin Cities Book Festival. It was such a tremendous conversation. I want to take a quick moment to thank all of the authors who've appeared with us over the past 3 days, the exhibitors in our online book fair, the media sponsors who've supported us, the great independent bookstores selling the authors' books, keeping those 86 cents in our communities. And finally, I want to thank the Minnesota State Arts Board and the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council for providing funding. That funding, folks, it's important to remember, came from a legislative appropriation from a fund that was created by voters. We did that. We can do it again. So please vote. Get everyone you know to vote. It is the first step, among others. Finally, I want to thank the audience. You have been tremendous. It's been a challenging year, and again, we miss seeing you in person, but as we head toward a winter, we know that we're all with each other. Stay strong, everybody. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.